In 1885, a London magistrate called her one of the most dangerous women in the city. It was a stark assessment, but perhaps a fitting one for a woman whose violence had put constables in hospital and left rivals permanently scarred. Who was she? And how did someone standing barely 4 feet 8 inches tall, a height that would have made her seem almost childlike, become a figure that grown men crossed the street to avoid? To find out, we have to go back to the beginning. Before we uncover her story, if you enjoy these journeys into the past, please subscribe to support the channel. Our story begins not in a courtroom brawl or a blood-stained alley, but in the overcrowded tenements of Victorian London's East End, where survival itself was a brutal education. The 1861 census for London gives us our first glimpse of her world. We find her aged around 10, living with her family in a cramped court off Whitechapel High Street, one of the most notorious areas in Victorian England. These courts were labyrinths of poverty, narrow alleys lined with decaying buildings where multiple families shared single rooms, where sunlight rarely penetrated, and where the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and open sewers was inescapable. This was the heart of London's darkest England, a world Charles Dickens had exposed, but which the respectable classes preferred to forget. Her father was a dock labourer, one of thousands of casual workers who gathered at the docks each morning hoping to be selected for a day's work. It was precarious, unpredictable employment. Some days he earned a few shillings, other days nothing at all. Her mother took in washing when she could find it, scrubbing clothes until her hands bled, earning pennies that barely kept the family from starvation. There were 7 children crammed into their single room, and our subject, being small even by the standards of malnourished East End children, would have learned early that being weak meant being a victim. In the East End, violence was not an aberration, it was the fabric of daily life. Women were beaten by drunken husbands with the law's tacit approval. Children were kicked and cuffed as a matter of course. Street fights over a dropped penny or an imagined slight were common entertainment. For girls, the options were few and grim. Domestic service, which often meant sexual abuse by employers, prostitution, which was effectively slow suicide, or marriage, which frequently meant exchanging one form of exploitation for another. The streets themselves were a battleground where the weak were preyed upon, and where reputation, the perception that you were too dangerous to cross, was the only real protection. In 1861, she was just a girl navigating this brutal landscape, where being small and female made you a target for every predator on the streets. But she would learn a lesson that would define her life. That ferocity, deployed without hesitation or mercy, could compensate for lack of size. That fear could be a weapon more powerful than any knife. And that in a world that offered her no legitimate power, she would seize the illegitimate kind. By the time she reached adulthood, the streets had taught her their cruelest truth: strike first, strike hard, and never ever show weakness. By 1871, the census finds her in her early 20s, and the family structure we saw a decade earlier has collapsed. Her father is gone, whether dead, imprisoned, or simply vanished into the anonymous mass of London's destitute. We cannot know. Her mother is listed as head of household, her occupation given as charwoman, meaning she scrubbed floors and cleaned wealthier people's homes for wages that kept her perpetually on the edge of starvation. Several of her siblings have disappeared from the record entirely, possibly dead from the diseases that swept through the slums with regularity, possibly in workhouses, possibly themselves absorbed into the criminal underworld. Our subject is recorded as living in a lodging house on Dorset Street, later to become infamous as the street where Jack the Ripper would claim his final victim. Her occupation is listed simply as hawker, a catch-all term for street sellers, but the reality was likely more complex. For young women in the East End, survival often meant a combination of legal and illegal economies, selling matches or flowers during the day, stealing or soliciting at night. The lodging houses where she now lived were anarchic spaces, dens of thieves and prostitutes where violence erupted nightly over the price of a bed or an accusation of theft. It was in this world where women had to fight men for survival, where physical strength determined your place in the hierarchy, where the police were as likely to be predators as protectors, that her violence first appeared in the official record. The difference between her and countless other struggling women was that she refused the role of victim. Where others endured, she attacked. Where others cowered, she fought back with a savagery that shocked even the hardened residents of the East End. On a spring evening in 1873, her name appears for the first time in the Thames Magistrates' Court Register. The charge was assault. Another woman, a fellow street seller, had accused her of territorial encroachment, selling flowers on her corner. The resulting fight, witnessed by multiple people, was described in testimony as extraordinarily vicious. Despite her small stature, she had beaten her opponents severely, using a heavy wooden board as a weapon, targeting the face and head with methodical brutality. When bystanders tried to intervene, she turned on them as well, biting one man's hand so severely he required medical attention. The magistrate, reviewing the testimony, expressed bewilderment that such violence could come from one so diminutive in frame. The prosecuting solicitor noted that she showed no remorse, had threatened witnesses, and seemed to possess a temperament wholly unsuited to civilized society. She was sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment with hard labor, her first taste of Victorian justice, but far from her last. This was just the beginning of a criminal career that would span more than 2 decades and establish her as one of the East End's most feared figures. On the 14th of November, 1878, the East London Observer reported an incident that would cement her reputation. Now, in her late 20s, she was charged with a violent assault that had left a police constable seriously injured and had required 3 officers to subdue her. The circumstances, as laid out in court, revealed her method: compensate for lack of size with extreme, unexpected violence, and never hesitate to escalate. Constable William Marsh, a man of considerable size at over 6 feet tall, had attempted to arrest her for causing a disturbance outside a public house on Commercial Street. According to his testimony, she had appeared initially compliant, even docile, seeming to submit to the arrest. But as he took her arm to lead her toward the station, she had turned on him with explosive violence. She bit deeply into his wrist, tearing through the flesh until he released his grip. Before he could react, she had driven her fingers toward his eyes, attempting to blind him, and when he raised his arms to protect his face, she kicked him in the groin with such force that he collapsed to the ground. 2 other constables rushed to assist, and the struggle that followed was described by witnesses as shocking to behold. She fought with what one officer called the fury of a wild animal, using every part of her body as a weapon. She bit, scratched, kicked, and when they finally restrained her arms, she spat in their faces and hurled obscenities that shocked even the court recorder. It took all 3 men to carry her to the station, and even there, in the cell, she continued to scream threats and kick at the door until she exhausted herself. In court, Constable Marsh's arm was bandaged, his face still marked with scratches. The magistrate asked him directly, "You are a large man, Constable. How is it that this woman caused you such difficulty?" Marsh's reply was honest and damning. "I've arrested many violent men, your worship, but I've never encountered such savagery. She fights not to escape, but to hurt. There's something terrible in her. No fear, no mercy." The courtroom fell silent as the full weight of his words sank in. This was not the testimony of a man embarrassed by defeat. It was the confession of genuine fear. The magistrate sentenced her to 6 months' imprisonment with hard labor, noting grimly that she represented a danger to public order despite her small frame. The newspapers picked up the story, fascinated by the paradox. A woman so small she barely reached an average man's shoulder, yet so violent that experienced police officers dreaded encountering her. It was perhaps the beginning of her legend. And it was only her 15th court appearance. There would be many, many more. Over the following decade, her name became a fixture in the magistrates' courts, appearing with grim regularity in the crime columns of London's newspapers. Each appearance added another layer to her reputation, another story whispered in the pubs and lodging houses of the East End. She was not just a criminal, she had become something more dangerous, a symbol of how far a woman might go when pushed beyond the boundaries society set for her. In 1882, she was arrested as the leader of a robbery gang operating in Whitechapel. The gang consisted of both men and women, but according to police testimony, she was unquestionably in charge. Her method was brutally effective. She would approach well-dressed men on darkened streets, appearing to solicit them. When they paused, some interested, others merely trying to brush her aside, her confederates would emerge from the shadows. But she was not merely bait. Witnesses testified that she was often the most violent participant, attacking first while her victims were still confused, signaling the others to join in. During one such robbery, the victim, a clerk returning home from work, fought back, and the struggle became savage. She struck him repeatedly in the face with a metal object, possibly brass knuckles, breaking his nose and cheekbone. When other gang members hesitated, frightened by the violence, she screamed at them to finish the job. One of her accomplices later testified against her, and his words painted a chilling picture. "We were all afraid of her, more afraid of her than we were of being caught. She had no limits. If you hesitated, if you showed weakness, she'd turn on you too." She was sentenced to 12 months hard labor. It was her 23rd conviction. In 1885, the incident that prompted the magistrate's declaration that she was one of the most dangerous women in London involved an assault on another woman that nearly resulted in murder. The fight took place in a pub on Flower and Dean Street, reportedly over a dispute about stolen goods. Our subject had armed herself with a broken bottle, and according to multiple witnesses, she had attacked with clear intent to maim or kill. She slashed her opponent's face repeatedly, targeting the eyes and throat, laughing as blood sprayed across the floor and other patrons screamed. The victim survived but was permanently disfigured, blind in one eye. In court, when asked if she had anything to say in her defense, our subject replied only, "She had it coming." The magistrate's pronouncement followed. She was among the most dangerous women he had encountered in his career. She received 2 years' imprisonment. It was her 31st conviction for violence, and she was not yet 40 years old. We have her entry in the 1888 Habitual Criminals Register, and it is here that we can see her for the first time, or at least see the official record of her appearance. The document is meticulous in its detail, as if the authorities needed to catalogue every aspect of this woman they could not understand and could not control: height, 4 feet 8.5 inches. The register notes this as diminutive stature, though the word seems inadequate for someone barely reaching most people's chest. Build: stout with unusually muscular arms, the result perhaps of years of hard labor in prison and a life spent fighting. Her complexion is described as sallow and pockmarked, her dark brown hair cropped short in a style more practical for someone who expected to be in fights regularly. Her eyes, the report notes, are dark brown and cold in expression. The distinguishing marks tell their own story: a scar across her left cheek from a knife wound, another scar on her right hand from a bite self-inflicted during one of her arrests when she bit through her own flesh in an attempt to free herself from manacles. On her left forearm, a crude tattoo of a cross, likely done in prison with makeshift tools. The photograph, if we could see it, would show a face hardened by decades of violence, eyes that had long ago learned to show no fear, no regret, no recognition of any authority beyond her own will to survive. This was not a woman who had learned to appear harmless, to navigate the world. She had never been given the luxury of harmlessness, and so she had become what the world feared most: a woman who had weaponized her own existence. The pattern continued through the late 1880s and into the 1890s. There were assaults on police, assaults on fellow criminals, charges of theft, charges of receiving stolen goods, charges of drunk and disorderly conduct. Some incidents were major. Another serious assault in 1889, a prison riot she was accused of inciting in 1891. Others were petty, almost pathetic. Arrested for being drunk outside a lodging house, fined 5 shillings she could not pay, sent back to prison for 7 days. But even as her body began to fail, she was now in her 40s, considered old by East End standards. Her defiance never wavered. In 1894, appearing in court for the 67th time on charges of assault, the magistrate told her wearily, "You are too old for this life. When will you stop?" Her response, shouted from the dock, was a string of profanities that had to be struck from the court record. She was sentenced to 1 month. It was routine by then. The system had long since given up trying to reform her. The sentences were merely holding patterns, brief respites, before she returned to the streets, and the cycle began again. After her 80th documented court appearance in 1896, the newspaper reports begin to thin out. Whether she finally aged out of violence, whether she died quietly in some corner of the East End, or whether she simply ceased to be newsworthy, we cannot initially say. For a time, she simply vanishes from history, leaving behind only the fragmentary records of a life lived entirely outside the bounds of what Victorian society could comprehend or contain. On the 3rd of March, 1899, a woman matching her description, name, approximate age, known aliases, died in the infirmary of the Whitechapel workhouse. She was 49 years old, though the hard life she had lived made her appear far older. Her occupation on the death certificate is listed as hawker, the same vague designation that had followed her since young adulthood, a word that covered everything from legitimate street selling to theft to survival by any means necessary. Her life had come full circle. She had been born in the slums of the East End, had fought her way through its brutal streets for nearly 50 years, and now she died in the workhouse, the institution Victorians built to contain and control those they deemed failures, those who could not or would not conform to the rigid expectations of respectable society. The certified cause of death tells the story of her final years: cirrhosis of the liver, chronic alcoholism, and general debility. The cirrhosis speaks to decades of drinking, the cheap gin and beer that numbed the pain and the memories, that made the squalid lodging houses bearable, that dulled the edges of a life spent in constant violence. The chronic alcoholism was both cause and effect, the self-medication of someone who had seen and done things that could not be forgotten, who carried wounds that never healed. And the general debility, that catch-all Victorian medical term, was simply the recognition that her body had been used up, worn out by fighting, by prison labor, by hunger and cold, and the relentless grinding poverty of the East End. In a different world, her ferocity might have been called courage. Her refusal to submit might have been strength. Her ability to lead and inspire fear might have been leadership. But Victorian London had no place for such qualities in a woman, especially a poor woman. And so those traits, which in a man might have led to military honors or business success, in her led only to prison cells and workhouse wards and an unmarked pauper's grave. There was no family member present at her death. The informant on the death certificate was the workhouse master, a bureaucrat whose job was simply to record the disposal of another anonymous life. She died alone, as she had lived, surrounded by people, but trusted by none, feared by many, but loved by no one we can find in the records. No obituary marked her passing, no mourners gathered. The terror of the East End simply ceased to exist, her body disposed of in a mass grave with other paupers, her name already being forgotten even as the dirt was shoveled over her remains. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about Victorian women and violence, about power and survival, about the choices people make when every option is terrible. She was not an anomaly, not a singular monster dropped into the East End from nowhere. The streets where she lived were full of women who fought, who stole, who survived by force when necessary, but most of them were victims of male violence, defending themselves or enduring abuse because they had no other choice. She was different. She was, by all accounts, the aggressor. She initiated violence, led gangs, attacked police officers, and seemed to take satisfaction in the fear she inspired. And that terrified Victorian society in a way that female victimhood never did. A victimized woman confirmed everything Victorians believed about women: that they were weak, needed protection, required male authority to guide and constrain them. A woman who victimized others, who fought men and won, who commanded respect through terror, who rejected every feminine virtue society held sacred, threatened the entire edifice of gender roles that propped up Victorian culture. If women could be as violent as men, as dominant as men, as uncontrollable as men, then what justified excluding them from public life, from political power, from economic independence? Perhaps her violence was self-defense that never stopped, a survival instinct activated in childhood that could never be turned off. Perhaps being small meant she had to be twice as vicious to survive, had to establish a reputation so fearsome that her size became irrelevant. Or perhaps, and this is the interpretation that Victorians could not countenance, she simply discovered that being feared was the only form of power available to a poor woman in her world, and she seized it with both hands. Violence gave her agency. It gave her control. It gave her the one thing the world had tried to deny her: the ability to shape her own life, however dark that shape might be. She was more than her 80 documented court appearances, more than the litany of assaults and thefts that fill the newspaper archives. She was a girl born into poverty, so grinding that malnutrition stunted her growth. She was a woman taught that violence was the language of the streets, the only dialect that mattered. She was someone who refused to be a victim, even if it meant becoming a perpetrator. And she was a human being whose potential, whatever it might have been, was destroyed by a society that offered her nothing but suffering and then punished her for responding with rage. Today, no one remembers her name. The building where she died has long since been demolished. The streets where she fought have been rebuilt, but her story remains in the archives, preserved in the dry language of census records and court reports, challenging our assumptions about women, about violence, about the relationship between powerlessness and brutality. She lived and died in the Victorian era, but the questions her life raises are timeless. What do we owe people born into impossible circumstances? How do we judge those who refuse victimhood by becoming victimizers? And who are we to judge at all from our comfortable distance when we have never had to fight for our lives in the streets of the East End? But what do you think? Was she a victim who became a villain, shaped by the brutal world into which she was born? Or was she simply surviving the only way Victorian London allowed, using the only currency, fear, that society would accept from someone like her? How do we judge women who use violence in a world that denies them every other form of power? Let me know in the comments below.